Welcome to Quiz Time. I'm your host Simon. Sit back, relax, and let's get started. Which architect's revolutionary glass house in New Canaan became a modernist icon in 1949? Frank Lloyd Wright, Philip Johnson, or Ludwig Mies van der Rohe? Philip Johnson is correct. The term organization man entered business lexicon through whose 1956 sociological study, David Reisman, William H. White, or Wright Mills? William H. White is correct. Which painter's drip technique revolutionized abstract expressionism in the late 1940s? Willem de Kooning, Jackson Pollock, or Mark Rothko? Jackson Pollock is the correct painter. What economic doctrine guided Eisenhower's fiscal policy throughout the 1950s? Dynamic conservatism, supply-side theory, or Keynesian stimulus? Dynamic conservatism is correct. The kitchen debate of 1959 occurred at which international exhibition? Brussels World's Fair, American National Exhibition in Moscow, or Seattle World's Fair? The Brussels World's Fair is correct. Which composer's 1952 work, 433, challenged traditional notions of music? Pierre Boulez, John Cage, or Karl-Heinz Stockhausen? John Cage is the correct composer. The Bretton Woods system established which currency as the global reserve standard? British pound, gold standard, or US dollar? US dollar is correct. What literary movement did Jack Kerouac's On the Road 1957 epitomize? New criticism, beat generation, or confessional poetry? Beat generation is correct. Which advertising executive coined the term subliminal advertising in 1957? David Ogilvy, James Vickery, or Leo Burnett? James Vickery is correct. The transistor's invention at Bell Labs in 1947 earned which three scientists the Nobel Prize? Shockley, Bardeen, and Watson, or Shockley, Bardeen, and Britton, or Bardeen, Britton, and Kilby? Shockley, Bardeen, and Britton are the correct three scientists. Which method actor's performance in the 1950s redefined American cinema? Marlon Brando, Montgomery Clift, or James Dean? Marlon Brando is correct. The Marshall Plan's official name was the European Recovery Program under which secretary? Dean Acheson, George Marshall, or John Foster Dulles? George Marshall is correct. What artistic technique did Robert Rauschenberg pioneer with his Combines series? Pop art collage, mixed media assemblage, or abstract expressionist sculpture? Mixed media assemblage is correct. Which economists The Affluent Society, 1958, criticized American consumer culture? Milton Friedman, John Kenneth Galbraith, or Paul Samuelson? John Kenneth Galbraith is the correct answer. The 1947 Taft-Hartley Act primarily restricted what aspect of labor relations? Minimum wage standards, working hour limits, or union organizing activities? Union organizing activities is correct. Which choreographer revolutionized modern dance with Appalachian Spring 1944? Martha Graham, Merce Cunningham, or Jose Limon? Martha Graham is the correct composer. What corporate strategy did General Motors perfect in the 1950s consumer market? Vertical integration, planned obsolescence, or horizontal diversification? Planned obsolescence is the correct corporate strategy. The abstract expressionist movement centered around which New York neighborhood? Soho, Greenwich Village, or Lower East Side? Greenwich Village is correct. Which Federal Reserve chairman guided monetary policy through the 1950s economic expansion? Mariana Eccles, William McChesney Martin, or Arthur Burns? William McChesney Martin is correct. The term military-industrial complex was coined by which departing president? Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, or John Kennedy? Dwight Eisenhower is the correct president. Which jazz musician's 1959 album, Kind of Blue, pioneered modal jazz? Miles Davis, John Coltrane, or Thelonious Monk? Miles Davis is correct. The GI Bill's official designation was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of which year? 1944, 1945, or 1946? 1944 is correct. What architectural style dominated American corporate buildings in the 1950s? Art Deco Revival, International Style, or Brutalist Concrete? International Style is correct. Which novelist's Invisible Man 1952 won the National Book Award? James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, or Richard Wright? Ralph Ellison is the correct novelist. The Eisenhower Doctrine specifically addressed Cold War tensions in which region? Southeast Asia, Latin America, or Middle East? Middle East is correct. Which painting technique did Helen Frankenthaler develop in the early 1950s? Color field painting, soak stain method, or hard edge abstraction? Soak stain method is correct. Which management theorist introduced Theory X and Theory Y in 1960? Peter Drucker, Douglas McGregor, or Frederick Hertzberg? Douglas McGregor is correct. The 1956 Federal Highway Act created which massive infrastructure project? Transcontinental Railroad, Interstate Highway System, or Tennessee Valley Authority? Interstate Highway System is correct. Which filmmaker's Vertigo 1958 is now considered a cinematic masterpiece? Alfred Hitchcock, Billy Wilder, or John Ford? Alfred Hitchcock is correct. What economic phenomenon characterized the immediate post-war period, 1946 to 1948? Recession, stagflation, or inflation surge? Inflation surge is the correct phenomenon. The bebop revolution was led primarily by which two musicians? Duke Ellington and Count Basie, Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, or Miles Davis and John Coltrane? Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. Which Supreme Court case ended segregation in public schools in 1954? Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education, or McLaurin versus Oklahoma? Brown versus Board of Education. What artistic movement did Andy Warhol help establish in the early 1960s? Pop art, op art, or minimalism? Pop art is correct. The 1947 National Security Act created which new government agency? NSA, CIA, or DIA? The CIA is correct. Which economist's monetarist theory challenged Keynesian orthodoxy in the 1950s? Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, or Ludwig von Mises? Milton Friedman is correct. The New Look fashion revolution of 1947 was introduced by which designer? Coco Chanel, Christian Dior, or Yves Saint Laurent? Christian Dior is correct. What corporate merger in 1955 created the largest industrial corporation? Standard Oil consolidation, General Motor Fisher Body, US Steel formation? General Motors Fisher Body is correct. Which poet's Howl 1956 became a landmark of beat literature? Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, or Lawrence Ferlinghetti? Allen Ginsberg is the correct answer. The McCarran Act of 1950 required registration of which groups? Labor unions, communist organizations, or religious minorities? Communist organizations is correct. What innovative technique did Jasper Johns use in his flag painting? Photorealism, silkscreen printing, or encaustic medium? Encaustic medium is correct. Which conductor transformed the New York Philharmonic from 1958 to 1969? Arturo Toscanini, Leonard Bernstein, or Leopold Stokowski? Leonard Bernstein is the correct composer. The term suburban sprawl first described development patterns in which decade? 1950s, 1940s, or the 1960s? 1950s is correct. What dramatic technique did Tennessee Williams perfect in A Streetcar Named Desire? Epic theater, psychological realism, or theater of the absurd? Psychological realism is correct. Which monetary system governed international finance until 1971? Gold standard, Bretton Woods, or floating exchange? Bretton Woods is correct. The 1957 launch of Sputnik prompted which American educational initiative? Head Start Program, National Defense Education Act, or Elementary and Secondary Education Act? The National Defense Education Act. What sculptural initiative did David Smith pioneer in the 1950s? Kinetic sculpture, welded steel construction, or environmental illustration? Welded steel construction is correct. Which business philosophy dominated American corporations in the 1950s? Managerial capitalism, shareholder primacy, or stakeholder theory? Managerial capitalism is correct. The abstract expressionist painters were also known by which collective term? The Eight, the Ashcan School, or New York School? New York School is correct. What foreign policy doctrine guided American Cold War strategy? Massive retaliation, containment, or rollback? Containment is the correct strategy. Which playwright's Death of a Salesman, 1949, critiqued the American dream? Arthur Miller, Eugene O'Neill, or Tennessee Williams? Arthur Miller is correct. The 1946 Employment Act established which economic goal as a federal policy? Price stability, balanced budget, or full employment? Full employment is correct. What artistic technique characterized Franz Klein's black and white paintings? Minimalist reductions, gestural brushwork, or geometric abstraction? Gestural brushwork is correct. What sociologist wrote The Lonely Crowd, 1950, about changing American character? David Reisman, William H. White, or Vance Packard? David Reisman is correct. The Federal Reserve's Accord of 1951 established independence from which department? Commerce, Treasury, or State? Treasury is correct. What architectural innovation defined Levittown's mass-produced housing? Prefabricated modules, assembly line construction, or standardized blueprints? Assembly line construction is correct. Which composer's Music of Changes, 1951, used chance operations? John Cage, Morton Fieldman, or Earl Brown? John Cage is correct. The conglomerate business model emerged predominantly in which decade? 1940s, 1950s, or 1960s? 1960s is correct. What literary technique distinguished J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye? Stream of consciousness, first-person vernacular, or multiple perspectives? First-person vernacular is correct. Which act of 1947 reorganized American defense establishment? Marshall Plan, National Security Act, or Truman Doctrine? The National Security Act is correct. The color field painting movement was exemplified by which artist's work? Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, or Willem de Kooning? Mark Rothko is correct. What economic theory justified aggressive corporate expansion in the 1950s? Austrian school, growth economics, or supply-side theory? Growth economics. Which photographer documented American social landscapes in the 1950s? Ansel Adams, Robert Frank, or Edward Weston? Robert Frank is the correct photographer. The 1948 Marshall Plan allocated how much in European aid? 10 billion, 13 billion, or 17 billion? $13 billion. What dance style did George Balanchine develop at New York City Ballet? Modern ballet, neoclassical ballet, or abstract ballet? Neoclassical ballet is correct. Which management consultant coined the term knowledge worker in the 1950s? Peter Drucker, Douglas McGregor, or Frederick Herzberg? Peter Drucker is correct. The abstract expressionist movement rejected which previous artistic tradition? Impressionism, Cubism, or social realism? Social realism was rejected. What monetary policy characterized the 1950s economic expansion? Tight money, loose money, or natural stance? Tight money is correct. Which novelists The Man in the Grey Flannel Suit critiqued corporate conformity? John Cheever, Sloane Wilson, or Richard Yates? Sloane Wilson is correct. The 1954 Communist Control Act was sponsored by which senator? Joseph McCarthy, Hubert Humphrey, or Estes Kefauver? Hubert Humphrey is correct. What painting technique did Maurice Louis develop in the late 1950s? Hard edge painting, color staining, or optical illusion? Color staining is correct. Which economic indicator became prominent in measuring 1950s prosperity? Industrial production, gross national product, or consumer price index? Gross national product. The method acting technique was primarily associated with which acting school? Yale School of Drama, Actor Studio, or American Academy? Actors Studio is the correct school. What foreign policy crisis defined Eisenhower's first term? Korean War conclusion, Suez Canal crisis, or the Berlin blockade? The Suez Canal crisis. Which sculptor's mobiles revolutionized kinetic art in the 1940s? Alexander Calder, David Smith, or Louis Nevelson? Alexander Calder is correct. The 1946 Administrative Procedure Act standardized which government function? Budget process, federal rulemaking, congressional procedure? Federal rulemaking is correct. What architectural principle guided suburban development in the 1950s? Mixed-use planning, functional segregation, or vertical density? Functional segregation. Which jazz pianist approach influenced the cool jazz movement? Art Tatum, Lenny Tristano, or Bud Powell? Lenny Tristano is correct. The military-industrial complex primarily benefited which economic sector? Agriculture, services, or manufacturing? Manufacturing is correct. What literary movement did William S. Burroughs help establish? New journalism, Beat Generation, or Black Mountain Poets? Beat Generation is correct. Which Supreme Court Chief Justice led the 1950s judicial revolution? Fred Winson, Earl Warren, or Felix Frankfurter? Earl Warren is correct. The hard edge painting style emerged from which artistic movement? Abstract Expressionism, Geometric Abstraction, or Color Field Painting? Geometric Abstraction. What business strategy defined 1950s corporate growth? Diversification, specialization, or vertical integration? Diversification is correct. Which filmmakers The Treasure of the Sierra Madre won the 1948 Best Picture? William Wyler, John Huston, or Frank Capra? John Huston is correct. The 1950 Sella-Kefauver Act strengthened which area of law? Labor relations, antitrust enforcement, or securities regulation? Antitrust enforcement. What sculptural material did Louis Nevelson primarily use in her assemblage? Bronze, steel, or wood? Wood is correct. Which economic doctrine guided post-war fiscal policy? Classical economics, Keynesian theory, or monetarism? Keynesian theory is correct. The abstract expressionist paintings were characterized by which quality? Precise geometry, emotional intensity, or photographic realism? Emotional intensity. What marketing concept revolutionized 1950s consumer culture? Brand loyalty, planned obsolescence, or market segmentation? Planned obsolescence is correct. Which poets, partisan 1946 to 1958, redefined American epic poetry? Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, or Wallace Stevens? William Carlos Williams is correct. The 1947 Labor Management Relations Act primarily affected which sector? Government employees, private sector unions, or agricultural workers? Private sector unions is correct. What artistic technique distinguished Cy Twombly's paintings? Photorealism, geometric patterns, or gestural mark making? Gestural mark making is correct. Which management theory emerged from the 1950s organizational studies? Scientific management, human relations, total quality management? Human relations is correct. The Beat literary movement centered around which California city? Los Angeles, San Francisco, or Berkeley? San Francisco is correct. What economic policy characterized Eisenhower's approach to government spending? Fiscal restraint, deficient spending, or balanced expansion? Fiscal restraint is correct. Which composers' prepared piano works challenge traditional music concepts? John Cage, Harry Partch, or Henry Cowell? John Cage is the correct composer. The 1950s suburban ideal was epitomized by which type of housing? Apartment complexes, single family homes, or planned communities? Single family homes is correct. What artistic movement did Larry Rivers help establish in the late 1950s? Minimalism, Neo-Dada, or conceptual art? Neo-Dada is correct. Which federal agency coordinated Cold War economic policy? Commerce Department, National Security Council, or State Department? National Security Council is correct. The abstract expressionist movement was primarily centered in which city? Paris, Los Angeles, or New York? New York is correct. What economic transformation characterized the post-war American economy? Agricultural expansion, service sector growth, or manufacturing decline? Service sector growth is correct. Congratulations and well done on completing this quiz. Please leave your score below in the comments, and as always, remember to like and subscribe so we can see you next time for some fun on quiz time.